welcome every location around the world. Woo! It is so great to be joining you where you are. If you're watching online, maybe you're watching this on TV at a later date or listening to this on a podcast, we are so excited. We're joining you from sunny, muggy Hereford right now. It is, the summer is actually happening. You know, we had like 1 week of sun and I thought that it was over, but actually it's still quite, I woke up this morning and I was sweating. I was like, this is the UK, what's going on? This is glorious. But anyway, as I said, my name's Dave and you're joining us here in Freedom at the very end of a series called Upside Down, Inside Out. Who's enjoyed this series? Come on. I've really enjoyed it. We've been looking at the myths that we believe about church, we believe about ourselves, and we've been busting them up, and it's been so great. And I love how some of the teaching, for me, it's been things I've never thought about, but some of it has been things that I knew or I understood, but it's just been opening up on a whole nother level. And here, right around our movement, actually, we've had that shift in our groups. It's just been so great getting together and digging into what God is doing and saying. Because we've been busting myths, but we didn't call this series Mythbusters. But actually, we called it Upside Down, Inside Out because we don't want this series to inform us. We want it to transform us. The whole point of this series is not so that we look at a kind of things that we might, believe a little bit wrong, but actually it would activate us and we would do something with it. We want to turn our thinking upside down, but we want to get the church inside out. A lot of the myths we've been looking at have had a trend to them about how we can get so involved into the four walls of church. And actually, we end up not being church outside of these environments. And it's so, so important to us that actually we are actioning. So I'm going to dive in straight away with this question. What have you been doing with these messages? Because here's the thing, even before I get going and I start speaking, you need to start asking yourself the question, what have I been doing with these messages? In our group this Wednesday, we kicked off and we opened up with a question because Heather last week spoke all about evangelism and getting out there and sharing faith. And we asked the question around the room, right, who's done something with that message? And there were maybe like a third of the hands went up. My hand stayed down. I'll be honest, my hand stayed down. Because do you know what happened? Sunday was great. Wow, what a great message, fantastic. And then Monday happened. And then Tuesday happened. And then Wednesday happened. And then, I've got groups, so I'm kind of reminded about it there. But actually, guys, something about this series, it's so important that we are digesting and we're actioning it, because otherwise it'll just remain a great series that we once had in church. But actually, it's all about actioning it. And today, this message that I've got for us is kind of a broad one to close out the series. And as I was preparing, I remembered something that happened to me about 5 or 6 years ago. Some of you will know, some of you won't, but I worked for Freedom. And a couple of years ago, I wasn't working full-time, I was working part-time. But one of my responsibilities, going back to about 2009, 2010, was our Christmas services. And the great thing about being in charge of the Christmas services is you get to do whatever the heck you want. You can just go wherever. And obviously, our Christmas services, they were all about, getting out there, sharing our faith, getting people to connect with the real meaning of Christmas. And we would throw the kitchen sink at it. If we could have had indoor fireworks, we'd have had indoor fireworks. I tried 3 years in a row, but I got a no. But it was mainly fire regulations and sort of, health and safety rubbish. But anyway, we would go at it. And so back kind of 2009, 2010, my responsibility, I ended up writing the script, directing the show, playing in the band. And, my life was like, this is it. We are pushing forward. I was digging into God's word. I was praying. I might have even fasted. I can't remember. But it was, it was kind of a real intense period of time, of action and proactivity. But what was super interesting was that I went on Christmas holidays, and I was fortunate enough to have 2.5 weeks off. And, we've been going at it the few weeks before Christmas, and we enjoyed mince pies. I love mince pies. It's July. I'm talking about mince pies. If anybody can find me some mince pies and buy me some mince pies, I'll buy them off you, but I love mince pies. I'd have them all year round. But anyway, we had a great Christmas. We relaxed with our family. We, obviously gave our gifts and different things like that. So January 3rd came, and I picked up my Bible. ready. I want to seek God, and I'm ready to go back to work. And after all, I work in church, so you probably should open up your Bible. And then I realized that it was the first time I'd opened it in 2.5 weeks. You guys are, ooh, Pastor, what you doing? What I realized, and it was a non-intentional mistake. I hadn't not looked at my Bible, but I hadn't looked in my word. And the thing of what it said to me was there was a compartmentalization that had happened in my mind, that somehow certain elements of my relationship with God were for certain seasons and certain needs over other ones. Because we get into our Bible when, if maybe you're asked to speak, you be in your Bible. If I came up to you this Sunday and said, hey, we've got a treat for you. Next week you're preaching. You'd be like, oh my goodness. In fact, you'd probably sleep with it on your face, hoping that it would absorb into you. I used to do that as a student when I'd be trying to revise. I'd be falling asleep because I'm tired. Oh, maybe if I just do this, it'll just impart into my brain. Never worked, by the way, don't try it. You just end up with black on your face. But the realization was that I compartmentalized. And it actually took me back to another conversation I had a couple of years earlier. I used to live in London, and when I was in London, I was doing an internship in a church there. It was an amazing opportunity, but it was also a really challenging couple of years. And I've shared a bit about what God did in me in that time previously. But right at the start of being there, I didn't know anybody. So I got an invite about 3 weeks in out to go to a local restaurant with some friends from the church that I was working for, and some other friends in the local area. So I'm kind of, chatting away, getting to know people. And one of my mates brought their flatmate who wasn't a Christian. Now, in my sort of heart, I'm like, if they're not a Christian, I want to go talk to them because I've got a passion to share my faith. And we didn't necessarily talk for an overly long amount of time or have any kind of profound conversation, but it was just in the mix of the night. The next week, my friend, their friend, who was actually my line manager, in my first one-to-one said, Dave, can I reflect something to you? And I said, yeah, go for it. You're wondering what happened. Anyway, and she said, when we got home, my flatmate said, oh, Dave's interesting, isn't he? Now, when somebody says you're interesting, get ready to be offended or hurt or reflected something that you'd much rather ignore. Anyway, basically, this friend had said to my friend, yeah, he kept talking about all his different lives. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said that apparently in the conversation, without even thinking about it, I'd been segmenting my life by using phrases like, well, yeah, that's my spiritual walk. Oh, that's my work life. That's my friendship life. Oh, that's my time with God, and this is my time without God. Now, I knew that wasn't real, but out of my mouth, my heart was speaking. That in fact, actually, we segment God into areas, and we do it for multiple reasons. Sometimes we do it for personal gain. Because if we can exclude God from a certain area, God doesn't really mind about what I do with my finances. I mean, come on. We segment him in other areas. And in fact, it leads on to the myth that I want us to look at today. The myth is that church is spiritual, and that work, rest, and play is not. Now, listen, okay, if you've been in church for any number of months, I already know that you know that's not true. But here's the deal. We live like it is. And in fact, actually, a lot of the myths that we've been looking at, for those of us who've got a faith and an established faith, we already knew that worship wasn't just what happened for 20 minutes on a Sunday. We already knew that we didn't have to just bring people to church to share the gospel with them. We already knew that church wasn't the building, but here's the problem. We still live like it is. We know that God is involved and interested in our whole lives, but we still live like he isn't. And, I remember sort of thinking about this. Well, I'll be in my Bible for my work when I really need to get that Christmas play together, but not in my rest, not in my time off, not in my space. But you see, the problem with this is that God is interested in your everyday, not your once a week. God is more interested in your everyday than your once a week. And you may not know this, and this is kind of a little bit deep, and we're going to do a series around this later on in the year. But we believe as Christians that each and every single one of us, whether we are the greatest person in the world or whether we've struggled with things and made terrible decisions, we've all done something wrong somewhere, and we call it sin. And that sin has separated us from God. And we believe that Jesus dying on the cross and raising back to life 3 days later, if we give our lives to him, it deals with that. And one of the benefits is that we get to start to live in hope and freedom and life now. But probably the biggest benefit is that after we die, we go to live with God in heaven for eternity. You know, what a massive and amazing thing. But not many of us think about something else that happens at eternity. Because whilst for a Christian, we will get before God and he'll say, Jesus has dealt with that, we'll also be asked to give an account of what we did with our days. And I'll just want to suggest this. I think God's going to ask you less about what you did in church once a week, and he's going to ask you more about what you did on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, on Thursday, in our rest, in our work, and in our play. You know, God actually started this year talking to me, and he said, Dave, I want you every day to be ready to give an account of your stewardship. Every day, I want you to be ready to give an account of your stewardship. In other words, it's not just that church is the spiritual space in my world, but in my work, in my rest, in my play, in all of those different things, God's heart matters the most to me. And when I say the word stewardship, I mean that God has given me things, and what I do with it says a lot about how I feel towards him. What about our holidays? Do you really see that as something that God's given you or that you earned because you worked a certain number of days and you've got 22 days of annual leave, which is a gift in itself because we don't need to be given that in the first place? Is it something that you view that God gave you as a time and a space that he could move? You know, we've recently just joined a new gym and spa, and do you know what? We can't wait. We went this week. It was absolutely fantastic on the hot beds, burning my calves. Oh, my goodness. And it was fantastic. And it's a place of rest. It's a place of recovery. It's a place of recuperation. But as we drove out to it, the first thing we did was we just started to pray and say, God, we give you this time. God, we want you to speak to us, because we recognize you're not just interested in our work. You're not just interested in what we do in church. You're interested in these moments as well. Bit of a shout out to Joff and Sean, who are campus pastors over in Bruges. They recently went on a holiday because they're about to have a child. Now, if you know you're about to have a child, go and take a holiday. It's a really wise thing to do, okay? I love being a dad, but you know, just take a holiday. Trust me. All right? Anyway, they went on holiday and they had 7 days in the sun, and they've been working super hard. They've been going at it, 100 mile an hour, and they're about to head into this other season. And in one sense, you could have expected them just to go off the pedal. Right, we're off comms. Here we go. Everything away. But I was getting emails from Joff about the things that God was downloading to him on holiday, because he was making space for God in his rest. He was making space for God in his recovery, in his recuperation. And here's the reason why. It's not because he's a pastor. It's because he actually truly loves God and wants God to be involved in his whole life. You see, when we live that myth out, that church is somehow the spiritual world and the spiritual part of what we do, and work and our rest and our play is not, the challenge is we miss out on where God is every day of our lives. And the reality is it's easier to worship, to pray, to grow on a Sunday, because often somebody else is doing the hard work for you. You just had to turn up. Somebody else was here from 7:45 preparing the worship set. Somebody else has been praying into the word and digging into it. Somebody else cleaned this place so that it was comfortable for you. Somebody else has got the coffee and the tea ready downstairs. Do you know what? Church is great, don't get me wrong, but it's so easy. And that's why we do it. We have this bubble of church, and we can tend to ignore God in the rest of the part of our week, because actually church is the easiest place to do it. And it's the place that actually you can ride on somebody else's momentum and willingness and hard work rather than our own. But you and I know That if we want to build a church that is truly going to impact the world around us, and that's our intention, we are not planning in Freedom on just making a little dent. We want to change the world. We want to change our generation. We want to change the world. We want at the end of history for Freedom Church to be a big part of what said, these guys made an impact. We're not going to make an impact if Sunday is the only place we're engaging with God. And if Sunday is the only place where it's a priority. And you guys might say, oh, this is really simple. Yeah, it is. But the reality is that we don't live it out. Do we? We don't. So often we don't. As I was preparing this, I thought about one of the most famous Bible characters, Joseph. I mainly thought about him because as I was walking into town to get my hair cut this week, all the cows had come down to the river. And it was like a really weird moment. And they were all there. And I just sort of thought about the dreams Pharaoh had. And Joseph is one of the most famous guys. 15, 20 years ago, there was the stage play, wasn't there? Who went to see Joseph in his Technicolor Dreamcoat? Anybody? A crash of drums, a flash of light, my golden cloak. Flew out of sight, was it? And everybody in Uganda is going, they are strange. They are strange. Anyway, it was a stage show. It was all about Joseph. And Joseph's a very famous Bible character. And, you've probably heard a message about Joseph because he's an incredible example of endurance and faith and humility and all those kind of things. But I think Joseph is an incredible example of someone who lived for God every day, in everything, in every way possible. Joseph never forgot about God. And I believe his life is an example of what that looks like, and we can attain to that. So we're going to take a look at Genesis 37, verse 1 to 2, and we're going to dive into the very beginning of this story. So Jacob, that's Joseph's dad, he lived in the land of his father had stayed, the land of Canaan, and this is the account of Jacob's family line. Now we're going to pause there. Jacob is a big deal, okay? Jacob's not just another guy in the Bible. The hinge of Christianity is that we believe God's made a promise with mankind. And that promise was made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Jacob is a big, big deal. Being a son of Jacob isn't just, I'm, a son of another guy who went throughout history. Being born into Jacob's family meant your life potentially had great significance and mattered hugely in the context of what God would do in the entire world. So it's a really, really big deal. Jacob's got two wives, Leah and Rachel. He falls in love with Rachel, and he ends up trying to marry her, but Rachel's dad does him over, and he ends up working for 7 years, but he gives him Leah instead, and then has to work for another load of years to get Rachel. Rachel then can't have babies, but Leah can. So Joseph's got sort of 4 or 5 brothers from Leah, and then Rachel and Leah give their handmaidens, their female servants to Jacob, and then he marries them as well, and then he starts to have children with them. Now, the reason why Jacob ends up loving Joseph more than the rest is that he's born to Rachel in his old age, and we'll have a look at this. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. Now, these were the ladies that he didn't originally marry. So these brothers are Joseph's half brothers, okay? There's significance in this. Follow with me on it. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, he's 17. So maybe you could say that he was a little bit of a moaning teenager. Dad, they didn't include me in the games. They were playing pin the tail on the sheep or something, whatever. No, but actually what we know of Joseph's character over the next few chapters is that he's a stand-up young man, he's honorable, he's hardworking, he's honest, he's diligent, even in scenarios where you and I would probably justify him doing something different. So when the Bible says that he brought a bad report about them, in other words, what it's trying to teach us is they were doing something they shouldn't be doing. You see, Joseph understood that he needed to honor his dad in the field as well as in his presence. Joseph understood that being around Jacob wasn't just about when he was in his courts or in his living room. It was every single area of his life. Joseph lived for God every day in everything. Whether it was out in the fields tending the flocks, whether it was at home talking with his father, he honored God in everything at every day. But his brothers didn't. Now, I've been speculating on my own as I've been preparing this as to what the brothers were doing. Maybe they were kind of stifling off a little bit of the cash when they were selling flocks. Perhaps they had, a herd and there were 10 new sheep, but they told Jacob that there were 8, and they sold 2 and kept some. Maybe they were drinking on the job. Maybe they were lazy. Maybe they just weren't where they told Jacob they were. But either way, they weren't living out in the fields the way they would have lived in Jacob's presence. And Joseph comes and says, he's a man of honor. He says, I want to live for you in every aspect of my life, and I'm conscious of it, and I'm not just going to follow the trends of the world. So I want to ask you this. Those of us who have self-assessments, or we're sole traders, or we employ ourselves, how many of us have swindled the books, maybe to, adjust our tax a little bit, because, it's okay. I'm tithing. God doesn't mind about that. Or it just got kind of real. Because we don't think he notices what happens in the fields. We take that little extra bit from the work store cupboards because we've got surplus anyway. It's only a couple of pence. And listen, this isn't said with condemnation. What it is that we need to live for God in every area of our lives, in our work, in our rest, in our play. That's just one example. How many of us have gone on holiday and not even thought about God? I've done that. I've thought about the beach. I've thought about the free food. I've thought about the margaritas. And I haven't necessarily thought about Jesus. Because I'm not conscious of it, because Jesus, he fits into the spiritual box over here. He fits, and he doesn't matter. I'm on holiday. I'm on holiday from you, God. But actually, maybe he wants to go on holiday with you. Maybe he wants to work with you. You see, Joseph, I guess I want to ask this question. Are you Joseph, or are you the other brothers? Or in what areas of your life and my life are we Joseph? And in what areas of our life are we the brothers? It's hard. Yeah? It's real. It's a real question. But anyway, Joseph, we know he goes on to have these dreams. And basically, he interprets these dreams like this. I'm going to be pretty awesome. And you guys are going to bow down to me. Listen, it doesn't go down well. Even with Dad. Jacob doesn't really like this either. And so he tells this story. And it's basically the last straw for the brothers. Not only does he tell on them, but now he's saying, you're going to kind of bow down to me. And it's going to be pretty awesome. And even Dad's going to do it too. So we know that later on, his brothers plot to kill him. And this is where we're going to pick it up in verse 12 to 14. Now his brothers had gone to graze their flocks near Shechem, and Israel, that's Jacob, said to Joseph, as you know your brothers are grazing flocks near Shechem, come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, Joseph said. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Now I've never really noticed this before, but basically he's sending Joseph to go check up on them. He's sending Joseph to go and see what they're doing in the fields. Think about it. If verse 1 and 2, he brings a bad report, and then verse 12, 14, he sends him back out to go and see if it's all well with your brothers. I don't think he's just kind of, go and see how they are. I think there's an element to which he's saying, go and see what's happening. I want to say this. God is interested in your 24/7. And the Holy Spirit is more present with you in the times you don't think are spiritual than the ones you are. Your attitude, the way you speak, the things you do. I believe that God the Father might even say, hey, go check out how they're doing in their fields. Because he's interested in who you are. Because church is not the only spiritual place of our life. Our entire lives are spiritual. God is interested in everything. This year, as I've been trying to work out that phrase that God said to me, every day be ready to give an account of what you've done. It's crazy, the level and the depth that he's going to, my motives, the things I say, the things I think. And do you know what is a result of that? I am more aware of the presence of God in every minute minute of my world than ever before. Whereas it used to be Sunday. Or maybe, at worst, the cave. And we endure the Sundays in between, the 51 weeks, and then we feel God at the cave. Because it's all about events, and it's all about places. And it's all about those moments where somebody else does the hard work for us. And then I can feel God. But actually, it's about walking with him consistently in everything. I guess you could also ask yourself a question. Would you do what you do? Would you say what you say? Would you think what you think if he was in the room? Would you do what you do? Would you think what you think? Would you say what you say if he was literally in the room? Now, it's going to feel like this is kind of heavy and condemning, but we're going to bring it round to why this is so powerful. Because we know that Joseph's life, he wasn't just a holier than thou. God used him through this attitude and approach to save entire nations. And that's why we're going to look at it. Even later on, Joseph, he becomes a slave, he's sold into slavery, and he ends up working for a guy called Potiphar. Now, Potiphar is a pretty influential guy within Egypt, and he ends up getting promoted. Because when you live for God every day in everything, you can't avoid promotion. It says Potiphar said that he noticed that God was with Joseph. Why was God with Joseph? It's because Joseph was with God. If we want to have the favor and the presence of God enough, we've got to be spending time in his presence and living his way, and God will elevate. If we humble ourselves to live like that, it says God will raise us up. But he ends up, he's a bit of a good-looking lad. He's tall, he's buff, much like my 5'7" self. And anyway, Potiphar's wife fancies him, and she says, quite fancy a little bit of time with Joseph, and she wants to sleep with him. That's the reality of it. And so she comes up to him and she's saying, come to bed with me, come to bed with me. Now Joseph's response, he's been abandoned by his brothers, close to murdered. He's now away from his father. In one sense, he is so far away from his father's God, he wouldn't need to honor him in like a human way. But this is what Joseph actually says. In Genesis 39:9, he says, no one is greater in this house than I. My master has withheld nothing from me except you because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against Potiphar? No, he is conscious of God. Sin against God. I couldn't do that to God. I won't want to do that to God because God's right here. Now think about the setting that he's in. He's in Egypt. Egypt don't believe in the same God. They don't practice the same practices. He's about as far away from the church as he possibly can, and he may never get back. But he's still conscious of God. He's still thinking about how he can honor God, how he can live for God, because he's aware that God is interested in every decision, in every action, in every motive, in every moment, because that's the way that his power is going to flow through us. Think about this as well. He probably could have gotten away with it. If Potiphar's wife was willing enough to go and, put the opportunity out there, I think she probably wouldn't have minded having her cake and eating it. I don't know much about Egyptian culture, but I do know this. They didn't mind promiscuity. So he could have gotten away with it. No one would have known, but God would. Are there things in our world that we kind of get away with because no one knows, but God does? And it's okay on a Sunday, but actually, what about Monday? It's challenging, isn't it? It's challenging. And why? Why don't we live for God every day? I think it's because we want our cake and eat it. We want to have the grace of Sunday and the indulgence of Monday. We do, don't we? We get told the gospel, God comes to save you, to love you, to give you life and life in all its fullness. And everybody's like, sign me up. But I also want to keep that. And I also want to keep this. And somebody, when I was a young Christian, it was back in the days when you would buy CDs. And it's almost like you've got this messed up, screwed up, scratched up CD that is your life. And you come to the counter and you say, I've got nothing really to bring. And Jesus says, here you go, have a brand new one with 10 completely perfect tracks. But what we do is we stand at the counter going, well, I like track 4 and 5 of this. Can I keep track 7 of that one? I really like having track 9, but could I? And we want our cake and eat it. We want to have the blessing of God's presence, but we also want to have the things that we desire in the moments as well. I think another reason is, we can sort it out Sunday. We've carried through this kind of confessional thing that came from the early established church that do whatever you need to do and whatever you feel like doing as long as you confess it on Sunday. And as long as you do it on Sunday. As long as you get right. And hey, listen, I'm not saying that this is a place that you should be perfect in order to come to. Not at all. What I'm talking about is our motivation on Monday, on Thursday, in those moments. Because church is not the only spiritual place in your world. Your work, your rest, your friendships, everything. And if we were a church that were aware of God at 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, maybe in Starbucks, we wouldn't just pick up our latte, but we'd pick up a prophetic word for the person that's serving us, and we would sow a little bit of heaven. Or are we just waiting for heaven on Sunday? Are we just waiting for heaven on Sunday? Are we just waiting for a bit of God on Wednesday night at our group? But actually, this is it. You see, Joseph, by living this consistent, daily, present place with God, was seeing God move through him daily. Even he then goes to prison again, and he gets put in charge of the prison. Now, I think sometimes, when we're having a hard week, it is harder to do it. But think about Joseph. Nearly murdered, abandoned, put in prison for a crime he didn't ever commit. Then when he helped two guys get out of prison, they forgot him for 2 years. So he stayed another 2 years in there. And then finally gets promoted back up. You see, the power of when we live for God every day, in the good and in the bad, means God's purpose will eventually come to pass. I think the other one is God doesn't mind. There's grace for that. He doesn't mind. But actually, God does mind, and God wants our work. He wants our rest. He wants every aspect of our life, because when we live like that, ultimately, we will walk in his blessing and in his power. He's not controlling. He's not a micromanager going, no, he actually wants, he knows what's best for us, and so that's why we've got to be conscious of it day in, day out. So where does God feature? In your work, in your rest, in your play. Where does God feature? Some of us are about to go on holiday this year, and you are desperate for that rest, and you can't wait to sit by the pool, and I can't wait for you to do that as well. But what are you praying about in the run-up to it? Say, God, I want to hear from you. God, I want to be close to you. God, I want to spend time with you, because I want you in every aspect of my life. What about couples when you go out on a date night? Why couldn't God speak there? What about at the school run? Why couldn't God speak there? Is it because you're too stressed and you're late? Like I am most of the time? Get in the car. God challenged me. This Monday I was on the school run, and I had to get back to the office to run a prayer meeting. And I got back to the office, and God said this: you have rushed so quickly because you were going to the event to hear from me, that you didn't listen to me the whole way through the last hour and a half. Because the spiritual moment is the prayer meeting. Oh no, actually the most spiritual moment is the car journey, where I'm actually tested, where my response actually matters. Those are the moments. Because we need to live for God every day in everything. That's the truth. Every day in everything. Every day in everything. Because if we do that, then we run the risk of doing something amazing like Joseph. We have the potential of seeing God do something through our lives that is truly unbelievable and outstanding. If we choose not just to box God and the spiritual moments of our world into Sundays and spiritual gatherings and groups, but we actually start to live for him with a consciousness to our sight and to our ears and to our heart and to our mind, that maybe brushing your teeth could be the most holy moment of your day. One of our campus pastors a few years ago, going back, I was kind of leading him and pastoring him, and he felt like he just really couldn't ever hear from God. And as we dug into it, what he really thought was, I can't hear from God the way my friends do. Because they talk about, I was walking down the road and I just saw the Lord revealed this huge picture to me. And he was like, I don't hear like God like that. And I said, hey, why don't you just give God your moment where you brush your teeth and see what he does? I think he called me within 4 days, and it all turned around. Because he had this perspective that God would only speak to him in a certain manner, in a certain way, on a certain day, in a certain condition. But actually, when I'm in the bathroom, that's most of the time that God speaks to me. Because it's most of the time that I stop. You know, when I'm driving down the road in those moments, if I'm conscious, if I'm there, ready, if I'm taking all the things we've been taught this series, that I'm not just worshiping for 20 minutes on a Sunday, but I've got the worship on in the car, while I'm cooking. You know, I was doing the washing up recently, and God just met me at the flipping washing up. I was soaking. And I'm stood there, and I've got soaking hands, and he's starting to speak to me about some massive thing that I haven't actually let go of and dealt with. I'm there doing the washing up. We can live like that because he wants to be involved in everything we are. And we know that, but we got to live like that. And the way we live like that is waking up every day with a mindset and an intention of saying, God, you have my attention. You have my attention. We've got to look at our lives and figure out the things that can just take our days captive, the things that we rush around and the things that we do. And we've got to find little ways of getting God in there. Maybe you are a full-blown, really committed businessman. Why don't you put into your calendar little alarm reminders for 30 seconds with this word? It's a revolutionary word, pray. And just spend 10 seconds. And in between meetings, just be like, God, I just give you this day. Rather than rushing, right, okay, next one. I can't wait to get to the end of this to get to group and spend some time with God. But we live for God every day in every way. Okay, we're going to close out here. Thank you so much for joining us around all of the locations. We hope that you've enjoyed this series. We're kicking off next week with Pastor G. It's going to be absolutely awesome. We're going to be digging into discipleship and what it looks like to follow Jesus. It's going to be amazing. Thank you so much for joining us.